Hello and welcome to the webinar for Heritage Stone Communication, which has been recorded for and generously funded by the UNESCO IGCP 637 HerSTONES project. This video is designed as part one of a three-part interactive webinar with more details on the following parts, which will include opportunities for open discussion later in the presentation. Let's get right into it. I would first like to acknowledge that I am recording this video on the lands of the Muwinina people who have lived in the southeast part of Lutruwita, now commonly known as Tasmania. The Muwinina people have lived, loved, and cared for this country for many thousands of years. There is no part of this land, no species, no waterway, no landscape that was not loved by people and cared for by people here before me, and I want to honour this in my contribution to protecting the land I live on. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As I previously mentioned, this is the first of three parts of an interactive webinar. The first part is this recorded introductory seminar to understand the terminology related to heritage stones and to categorise the types of modified geodiversity, including heritage stones, in order to simplify communication. I've developed this as a recording to minimize your time commitment and to allow more time for discussion in the following section. The second part will be an interactive workshop where we as participants can map our in-region examples against this proposed taxonomy. This will be held on Monday the 20th of January at 10 a.m. till 12 p.m. UTC. The third and final part is an open discussion board to discuss future priorities and usage of the taxonomy. As a community, and particularly for those of us whose local heritage geology are perhaps underrepresented in global conservation efforts, we will be able to share our thoughts and insights on the future of global and equitable heritage stone communication and conservation. I'd like to tell you a bit about myself. We'll all get to know each other in the upcoming discussion, but to introduce myself, my name is Zagani Scholes-Tolbert. I am a researcher at the University of Tasmania. I am non-binary, and my pronouns are she, her, or they, them. My background of study is in philosophy, geography, and environmental management. I'm really interested in the way we communicate conservation values, both in the professional space and to a broader audience. These studies have led me to explore the terminology we use to describe geological features in a research project that I completed in November 2024. I'm coming into this discussion about heritage conservation from a physical geography and a natural environment conservation background. I understand that many of you will be more familiar with heritage conservation, so I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective on heritage stone values and communication in the upcoming webinar. A bit about the HerSTONES project. So, HerSTONES is a project which aims to increase and improve recognition of globally significant heritage stones. I've included the official statement on the HerSTONES project so you can pause the video and read directly. For further information, as well as a fantastic gallery of images and videos of sites recognized by IUGS Global Heritage Stone Resources, please also visit the website www.herstones.eu. On the screen here is a map of heritage stones that are currently recognized by the IUGS. As you can see, these sites are primarily in Europe. One of the main aims of the HerSTONES project is to increase the number of recognized heritage stones in underrepresented countries. If your country is not represented on this map, this webinar is a great opportunity to bring awareness to heritage stones that are important and not yet conserved. So coming to the main part of the webinar today. In the process of my research, I've found many combinations of terms describing geodiversity that has been modified in some way. As you can appreciate, there are many different subtleties within each term, and this is part of the challenge. Each term, each way of communicating the values of these sites is deep and complex within its own context, but they are not understood so deeply outside their own cultural contexts. In this video, I'll explain the relevant terminology and show why it's important to be aware of the issues that arise when there are different understandings of one term. Let's get right to the heart of this video and unpack some meanings. What is modified and what is geodiversity? For anyone unfamiliar with the concept of geodiversity, I'd like to give a brief overview of this term first. The most agreed upon definition of geodiversity was put forward by geologist Murray Gray in his 2004 book, Geodiversity: Valuing and Conserving Abiotic Nature. He defined it as the natural range of geological, geomorphological, and soil features. It includes their assemblages, relationships, properties, interpretations, and systems. This term encapsulates a range of values of abiotic nature. But the specification of natural range in this definition implies not created by and ideally not interfered with by people. So what about unnatural or modified forms? Most heritage stones have been both physically modified by people, and many maintain geological significance. To understand what is really meant by modified geodiversity and its implications for heritage conservation, we need to dig deeper into what we mean by modified. What counts as modified, and why does it matter? Heritage stones are a form of modified geodiversity, which is any abiotic site, feature, or element which has been altered by humans in some way. Modification can take many forms. It can be achieved by adding material onto a landscape, such as buildings. This is known as aggradation. Or it can be created by taking material away from or degradationally modifying the landscape by carving into it for art or on a larger scale by quarrying. While modification is a source of pride in cultural heritage conservation, the modification may disqualify a site from conservation due to the alteration of its natural value in other forms of conservation. Global interest in geodiversity and geoheritage is rapidly increasing. Researchers and practitioners are excited to talk about this field, and since there is not yet a defined set of terminology to refer to, new language is being created all the time to communicate. This has resulted in over 200 terms being used to describe modified geodiversity, all with different levels of nuance. However, these terms don't neatly describe either only one type of modified geodiversity or even refer to one clear set of attributed values. This is a normal phase of science in emerging research fields. Language evolves, and terminology takes time to settle. As an example, the term biodiversity was not formally introduced to describe living species and ecosystems until the 1980s. Before then, there were many suggestions for how to name it, but since having settled the terminology, it has become easier to communicate and conserve our natural environment. We already know that modified geodiversity is an extremely broad topic. We'll now have a look into just how broad it can be and dive into some of the issues in streamlining communication. The second half of this video introduces a framework for classifying modified geodiversity and raises questions on how we can map existing terminology onto distinct categories. Before we go ahead and develop a refined taxonomy, and so that terms and their meanings are not lost or dismissed, we need to hear what you think of them and how they work for you. When you come to the workshop, we can unpack some of these meanings and find out how they are used in geoconservation and heritage conservation all over the world. So what types of modified geodiversity are we talking about? Analysis from my research showed that there are 20 broad types of modified geodiversity, including mining and quarrying, architecture, landforms of war, water infrastructure, and waste management, to name a few. I won't go into this in too much depth here, but I will include the full table with the materials for the webinar, in case you would like to read the full descriptions. Heritage stones do not fit neatly into a single category. In fact, depending on the context, a heritage stone could fit into almost any of these. Cultural context informs different frames of reference for what constitutes a modified site, element, or feature, and thus no preservation rationale can be truly universal or completely objective. Instead, we need to reflect both on our own cultural understandings of naturalness and gain awareness of others. How modified does something need to be before it surpasses the threshold for modification or even degradation? For example, here in Australia there's a long history of modifying rocks and landscapes, but modification in the sense of stone buildings only modified a small part of the country. Stone buildings were not widespread until European colonization in 1788. And as you know, we're a big place. There is still a lot of land, quote unquote, untouched in this way. As a result, the Australian threshold for modification is comparatively low. What we consider to be heavily modified, such as agricultural landscapes, may not be considered to be heavily modified in, for example, Europe. In some conservation contexts, sites that have surpassed a threshold of modification may not meet criteria for conservation. Without going into this too far, as it really is a can of worms, this calls into question the divide between nature and culture. In the context of heritage stones, modification is a positive thing. It's a source of cultural pride. But I just want to add as food for thought, what about degraded sites? Mining activity, road cuttings, even landfill may have geological importance. Should these sites be included in conservation so that we can learn more about them? For geological sites, this grey area is beginning to be addressed with initiatives such as UNESCO Global Geoparks, where human interaction with the physical environment is celebrated and encouraged in a sustainable way. Stones are rocks that have been used by people and usually have been shaped. They have been moved from their original location, so they are what's known as ex situ. They have also likely been chiseled, carved, or shaped in another way. Most International Union of Geological Sciences, or IUGS, heritage stones are modified. The criteria for IUGS recognition is on the slide here if you would like to pause the video to read. Further details can also be found by clicking the link in the bottom right corner of the slide. According to their criteria, IUGS heritage stones represent the best examples worldwide of the connection between geological knowledge and its implementation in significant architecture and monuments. Within this diverse array of geodiversity and conservation types, our primary focus in this webinar is on heritage stones. Heritage stones don't just have aesthetic or intangible cultural values, they can also have geoheritage value as modified geodiversity elements. Thinking about where you are located now or where your home is, are there any examples of heritage stones in your region that you would like to see recognized on a global scale? We'll have the opportunity to share these in the upcoming discussion next week. Stones are elements or features of tangible value found in geosites, geodiversity sites, geocultural sites, and heritage sites. The modification of heritage stones is a tangible value. We can see the carvings, the buildings, the rock art, but intangible values may not really modify geodiversity. A point of contention is the use of terminology typically associated with modified geodiversity in the context of sites that possess intangible values, those that can't be seen or touched, such as religious, spiritual, or aesthetic significance, but lack physical alterations. While these sites are indeed relevant due to their cultural heritage, they may fall outside the scope of modified geodiversity if they lack physical modification. For instance, Uluru, while it's certainly able to be seen and touched, it represents intangible cultural heritage associated with a geological feature due to its religious significance to the Anangu people of Central Australia. Such sites certainly constitute geodiversity and often geoheritage, but may not align with the concept of modified geodiversity. Geodiversity that has not been physically modified are therefore outside the scope of this workshop. They are incredibly important, but if we were to talk about them, we would be here all day. I want to include a bit of data from my recent research to show just how many terms are in use to describe geologically important sites that have been modified in some way. 35 combinations of 12 relevant words were analysed, as you can see in the blue table on the left. 200 further terms were uncovered in the analysis process, some of which you can see on the right. We will dive into some of these further in the second part of the webinar. There is a lot of important and useful information available under any one of these terms, but I hope this starts to illustrate the problem for communication. There are some overlaps in the usage of terminology, but some are used in a particular sense not necessarily captured by others. Importantly for our taxonomy, in a lot of cases, the definition and use of a term were not identical. This suggests that the definition is either vague or it has taken on a new meaning to a different author. This can be expected because culture and language shape the way we understand things. A term originating in Europe might be understood differently in, for example, South America. As an example, the term secondary geodiversity has a specific meaning in Czech Republic, but slightly different meanings in both Australia and Brazil. It is possible that, like natural geodiversity, certain terms describing modified geodiversity will be more common in specific regions or time periods. It is reasonable to expect that regions with long-standing geological traditions and a strong emphasis on geodiversity may use a broader range of specialized terms. It is also possible that, like natural geodiversity, the terminology that could be used to describe modified forms is so vague and amorphous so as to be nearly impossible to pin down, let alone use. The analysis of 35 of the most common terms revealed that there are 4 terms that consistently define modified geodiversity. I want to emphasize, though, that while these 4 terms have been used quite frequently in the literature, it's important to be aware that a term with low frequency does not equate to low regional functionality. These terms are cultural geomorphology, cultural geoheritage, anthropogenic geomorphology, and secondary geodiversity. Despite their relative consistency with definition, these terms do appear to relate to different features, and they are used to describe both those that have conservation value and those that don't. This can lead to misunderstandings in the values attributed to sites described by a term. When a term is really broad, it can be interpreted in many different ways. Additionally, the lack of awareness in the abundance of available terminology leads to missing out on similar research happening in other regions that could otherwise lead to collaborations and learning from others. To paraphrase Moon and Perez Hamel in 2022, what one knows, one names, and by naming, we ascribe meaning and action. So far we've learnt that there's a whole wide array of terminology, but their definitions don't necessarily line up with their use in practice. So, towards linking the two, the primary elements in what constitutes a modified geodiversity site are their location, whether they're in situ or ex situ, their value, whether the site is important for cultural reasons, and whether the site has been modified by adding material to the site, aggradational, or has taken material away via degradational methods. These broad categories of use for the terminology are based on the work by Kubalikova in 2017 and Sabo in 2010. In the following slide, I present a method to classify the types of modified geodiversity in order to work towards linking these types or usages with the terminology. The Modified Geodiversity Categorization tool is proposed to classify the types of sites we're talking about so that we can communicate what values are present. One of the aims of my research was to use this tool to find out if any terminology could fit neatly into one of the categories as a way of being able to clearly understand delineations between terms. There are 4 questions which relate to the usage categories I described in the previous slide. Whether your chosen site, feature, or element possesses heritage value, whether it is in situ or ex situ. If it's in situ, whether it's aggradational or degradational, and if ex situ, whether it is intact or not intact. There is also an additional category under Other, which represents sites that are neither in situ nor ex situ as they have been entirely artificially created. The resulting 9 categories all have their differences, and as we have seen, there's a vast array of terms that can be used to describe all of them. However, the terminology is blurred across all categories. No term fits neatly into one category. This framework is designed to link modified geodiversity terms, types, and features, and their condition under the conserved or valued and the not conserved or valued banners. Heritage stones can be classified using this tool, and by being included in the taxonomy process, can be more clearly communicated in geoheritage conservation. Heritage stones possess heritage value, are most often ex situ, and geologically speaking are usually not intact because they have been carved or shaped for art and architectural use. Of all the terminology available, are there any that describe these values without the possibility of misinterpretation? For example, cultural geomorphology implies heritage value, but does not answer the other 3 questions. Secondary geodiversity, if we can assume that it is ex situ, would not be intact, but not all of the literature agrees whether heritage value can be assumed just by having the label secondary geodiversity. What I would like to discuss in the upcoming interactive webinar is, how does this tool fit your expectations and examples for heritage stone communication and conservation? Is this categorization tool useful, or could we find a new way to both understand the types of modified geodiversity and communicate their values clearly? And particularly in relation to heritage stones, what terminology best describes them and minimizes the chance of misinterpretation? How do we move past this confusion and onto meaningful communication? I believe this can only be done through collaboration and mutual understanding. It cannot be achieved by someone simply ignoring all other terms in favor of one. To this end, I want to emphasize that I do not wish to suppress the long-standing and important work of others with my individual opinion. Instead, the aim of this webinar is to facilitate communication and bring together work from researchers and practitioners to synthesize opinions and to work through this normal phase of science and onto the next. This brings me to the conclusion of the introductory section of the webinar. I hope this video has raised some questions and some thoughts you would like to share. I would like to leave you with some questions to kickstart your thinking for the upcoming discussion on Monday, the 20th of January. What are the priorities for communication? What are we missing? Is it possible to unify the terminology? What would you like to see? Do you think any of the terms are particularly useful or not? The second part of this webinar will be interactive and it will be held on Monday, the 20th of January 2025. This workshop is designed to be interactive using the free software Menti, so if you could familiarize yourself with that website, you might find that helpful for the upcoming discussion. We will also introduce it in the workshop as well. Following the discussion on the 20th of January, there'll be a discussion board open for 1 week from the 20th to the 27th of January. And in this section of the webinar, we want to hear your stories, suggestions, and things you would like the HerSTONES committee and more broadly the IUCN to hear. This will be an open discussion board to share your thoughts and engage with other participants. It will be open for a week between the 20th and 27th of January 2025, so you can join as time allows you. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I really look forward to hearing from you in the interactive workshop, which will be held on Monday, the 20th of January at 10 until 12 UTC. Please see the slide there for the time for your local time for your country, and see you then. Thank you again very much.